Hi, I'm Phil Cooke, and welcome to the Phil Cooke Podcast. On today's episode, I want to share an interview I did on the 700 Club with Andrew Knox, one of their longtime hosts and reporters. He's a great journalist, and he pulled me aside when I was there to be interviewed on the main 700 Club. He pulled me aside to do a special interview. He had some really interesting questions he wanted to ask me about my book, Church on Trial, How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis. And he had a really interesting take because, you know, one of the things I talk about in the book is that 27% of Christians, one study indicates 27% of people that leave the church today do it because of a crisis or how poorly that church handled a crisis. So it's serious stuff. We're talking about losing a quarter of our church members. And this is not, they're not going to another church. They're walking away from God entirely. So it's critical that we get this right. This is so very, very important. Not just for that, but also for the victims, very often because churches just don't know what to do. They've not been trained, so they discount the victim or they ignore the victim. They don't pay attention when they should. So I think little things like that can make a dramatic difference. And I want to nip as many of these situations in the bud as possible. We want to start noticing red flags. We want to start being aware of potential crises situations long before they happen so that we can avoid them or navigate through them more effectively. So Andrew Knox from CBN 700 Club interviewed me about the book, and I thought his approach was a little bit different. So I thought you'd get a kick out of it. So I wanted to share that interview with you today.
Phil Cooke is a prominent media consultant, filmmaker, and author known for expertise in helping organizations leverage media to enhance their influence. In his latest book, Church on Trial, he examines the challenges and scrutiny facing the church and provides analysis of how churches can effectively respond to pressures while staying true to the core mission.
Author and CEO Phil Cooke says in today's digital culture, the opportunities for crises in a church or organization is amplified. Knowing how to respond quickly and appropriately is critical.
I believe it's not if a crisis will happen, it's when a crisis will happen.
In his latest book, Church on Trial, Phil gives you the tools to manage the unexpected so you can help your church or organization survive and move forward.
All right, Phil Cooke joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Churches, I don't think, and ministries want to talk about this, do they?
No,
really?
no. This is a very depressing subject for a lot of people.
And I don't mean that cynically, but when are we going to be on trial?
Exactly.
Scandals. And it's almost like the church thinks if we look into this, even before something happens, it would appear as if we already know something's wrong. Or
yes.
Does the secular world handle crisis even with more accountability sometimes than the church does?
Generally, they do. I live and work in Hollywood, and I see studios that have a scandal or a crisis, and they handle it very well in many cases. Obviously, with Harvey Weinstein, they didn't handle it too well. But in very many cases, at least the secular world understands this happens. People are fallen. They're going to do stupid things. And the church just wants to believe. And we're Christians. We want to believe the best about each other. And it's hard for us to believe that a pastor, or a youth leader, a staff member could do something that would be so inappropriate.
So the title, Church on Trial, why?
Yeah.
Why that title?
Well, it's the secular world is looking at us. I mean, it's interesting that one study indicates 27% of people that leave the church completely, don't go to another church, they leave the faith entirely, leave because of a crisis at their church or how poorly that church handled the crisis. That's more than 25% of the people leaving the church today. So if we could solve this problem, it would be a huge, huge step forward.
So people are leaving the church often because the church looks hypocritical or
Absolutely.
like there's cover-ups and things like that. So it's that we're not representing Jesus well.
Right. And the truth is, it's even when they're covering up, church leaders, they're trying to do their best, but they never, they don't teach this stuff in Bible college or seminary. And so pastors and church leaders are often blindsided when something like this happens. So they feel like, well, maybe I should keep quiet. Maybe we should cover it up. Maybe we should protect these people, when that's the opposite of what they should be doing.
Or maybe there's the thought, the more details that come out, the more it will disgrace the name of God.
Yeah.
We've got to protect the name of God. But at that point, we're doing a disservice to the Lord.
Yeah, I think God has a bigger, but he's able to handle his reputation by himself. We don't need to help. know. But the truth is, I think if we're going to build trust with the congregation or the general public, we need to tell the truth. I mean, don't cover anything up. Always be honest.
Do you think coming out of COVID, things have changed for churches?
Oh, yeah.
There's new challenges maybe and opportunities that weren't there before. And
Well, it's interesting that COVID, the great thing about COVID, if there is something great, was that it really showed churches the importance of media communication, because we had to, worship from our house, and we had to do it online and through live streaming. So that helped churches understand that media matters. But in this media-driven world we live in, scandals can explode quick, because in a text message, email, social media world, word travels really fast.
All right. So this is a great interview for people who run ministries, churches, or even a company, small business. It doesn't just apply to churches. But let's say a crisis happens in the organization. There could be some sexual misconduct, financial misconduct, and part of the leadership team says, or people who serve on the team, what do we do? How do we handle this? Not how do we get out of it, but what's our next step? How do you counsel people?
Well, that's really important. I always say the first call should be to an attorney. There's a lot of legal issues in many cases.
That sounds slick, doesn't it?
It sounds slick, but there are legal issues. I mean, I've seen churches that had to close because they didn't have the right insurance coverage. Or worse, I've seen pastors that had nothing to do with the misconduct because they didn't report it to authorities. They were threatened with jail.
So pastors go to seminary. They're not necessarily trained in any of this stuff.
No, not at all.
They know how to study the Old Testament and the New Testament and preach, but when it comes to crises, there's no training.
And honestly, I'm not an attorney or a counselor. I'm a communication guy. I'm a media producer. And I can tell you that how you communicate during a crisis can make or break your organization.
And so you get calls from ministries and churches, right?
Yeah.
In emergencies? I mean, with all kinds of scenarios.
All kinds. And the people don't realize, the sexual issues get the headlines, but there's financial issues like embezzlement, there's zoning issues, insurance issues. Churches get sued for a wide variety of reasons. So there's a wide, range of crises that can happen to a church or a ministry organization. So we just have to be ready to respond appropriately.
Yeah. One of the great parts is this is a resource for churches is the first, third or so.
Yeah.
You talk about how to establish yourself, maybe to protect yourself from some of these things. What are some of those steps?
So important. Having a transparent culture that helps you avoid a crisis is absolutely critical. You can't 100% avoid a crisis ever in this world we live in today, but you can certainly protect yourself. And I think transparency is a huge part of that. In the book, I talk about, I'm not a ministry leader, but in my media company, Cooke Media Group.
But you lead ministry leaders.
I do.
Interesting.
True. But in my company, I have 3 or 4 people that have access to my email, my calendar, my finances. When I come back from a trip like this, I'll turn in my receipts. I have an assistant that goes through them, my producer goes through them, and then our CPA goes through them. So it'd be hard for me to arrange an inappropriate rendezvous because I have so many people seeing what I do. And I even believe transparency is important physically. I'm an advocate of putting windows and glass doors in offices. There's really no reason that you can't have a window or a glass door in your office. Anything that would help stop that inappropriate first step could save a life, it could save a marriage, it could save a ministry.
So that's the key, I think you just said. There's a series of steps that lead to this scandal, right?
Yes.
It's not just often one bad decision.
Exactly.
There's little things. Do some people in leadership, secular or church, start to feel like nothing will catch up to me? I've got such a following that, is there a little structure that they feel uninhibited?
Well, it's funny you say that because I had a pastor that had gone through a huge scandal at his church. He had an affair with a woman, had to step down. And I talked to him 10 years afterwards. He called me out of the blue and he said, I've been through therapy. And he said, the therapist told me, he said, after a year of working with you, I've realized you're not a sex addict, you're a me addict.
Wow.
He said, you only think about you. He said, you were the leader of the organization. All the decisions went through you. The leadership team revolved around you. And he said, after a while, you start thinking it's all about me. And he said, in that case, it was really easy when the opportunity for a sexual relationship happened. I thought, well, it's about me. I'll take it. And so you're exactly right. Leaders can get to a place, an unhealthy place, where they can make some really bad decisions.
They can also be great influences on an organization. You talk about, like sometimes maybe it's not the leader who falls, but someone on their team or in the congregation or in the business.
Yep.
And a leader can really provide comfort and strength to a congregation.
Yeah. Being honest with the congregation is absolutely critical. We often, one of the things the church really messes up often is the victim. They never look after the victim like they should.
You make that really clear. The victim is the
you.
priority.
I wanted
and
to
you go back to
prioritize
that over and over and over.
Well, the congregation is also a victim, a secondary victim, because they believed in this church, they've supported it, they've financially supported it, they've been a part of it, and they grieve. They're shocked as much as anyone. So the more you can communicate the right information to that congregation, rebuild that sense of trust, the better off you'll be.
There's a bit of a generational differences in believers, like, people in their 20s from people in their 80s, how they represent the Lord, what they prioritize. How can a young generation of Christians positively impact culture representing the Lord?
Well, it's interesting. Young people are more skeptical, I think, than an older generation is. And so I think they just need to live a transparent life. I keep going back to that term, but it's so true. When you live a transparent life, there's not much people can accuse you of. One of the problems I see a lot is ministry leaders that travel around the world to minister by themselves. And I will often say, if I'm going to go on a trip like today to come here and do this interview, I can come by myself. But if it's more than 2 or 3 days, I'm bringing my wife Kathleen with me, because there's just I want to avoid that opportunity. So I think there's so many practical, simple steps like that we can take that will really shore up our reputation, our relationships, our life.
Do you think you'd be in a position to write this book if your father hadn't been a pastor and been hurt by his church, so to speak?
No, I don't think so. I growing up behind the scenes at the church, it's interesting. I've never felt a moment's calling to become a pastor,
right?
But I've worked with pastors. There you go. I've worked with pastors my whole life. I grew up behind the scenes at church. That red jacket's pretty cute. And and my dad's stepped down, was forced out of a church, not because of anything he did, but because of an elder that disagreed with him preaching about the Holy Spirit. And my dad didn't pay attention until it was too late. And so one of my big principles is, when you see a crisis happen or you see a red flag, the time to act is now.
Last question. If a church has a scandal happen, how can they rebuild trust with the community, with their own congregation?
I always believe that focus on what you do best. It's so often churches get bogged down in the past. They get bogged down thinking about the mistakes that happen. Deal with that, take care of victims, work on the perpetrator. But as far as the congregation and the future is concerned, concentrate on where you're going and don't get so stuck. Always think about the future and do what you do best.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Real good stuff.
Well, I really enjoyed that interview. The 700 Club, CBN, that's a great team up there. They're very, very professional, and I really enjoy any time I'm up there. And a shout out to Molly Young, who is their guest coordinator. She's fantastic. She really takes care of you when you're a guest on the 700 Clubs. It's great. I just love being there. And I want to remind you that you can get the book, Church on Trial, How to Protect Your Congregation, Mission, and Reputation During a Crisis, from any bookstore, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever you like, wherever you are in the world, you can get it. But as I've said before, I'm getting calls from pastors who are ordering boxes of books because they want to give copies to their elders. Maybe it's a ministry board of directors, or give it to their staff. They want to make sure everyone understands how to protect themselves from a crisis, how to see things coming before they happen, how to create a culture where you can avoid a crisis if at all possible. And then if one does happen, how to respond quickly, effectively, in an important way. We want to make sure victims are taken care of if there's a victim involved. We want to make sure that the congregation is notified as soon as possible. We just want to do it the right way. And so often, as you've seen in the headlines recently, churches don't do it the right way. So get a copy of this book. And maybe the best thing you could do is get a copy of it for your pastor. He could really benefit from this. So thank you very much for being a part of this. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Go to my blog at philcooke.com. You can find information, by the way, for buying it in bulk on my website. We've made a deal with the publisher to be able to offer it in bulk. And also sign up for my weekly newsletter. You can find it on the homepage there. I think it's important to get this information to you every week. It's basically the top 5 stories from my blog every week I send out on the newsletter. And you don't have to go to my website. You can just click it, and it's just super convenient. But I'm writing about stuff that you deal with every day. If you're a communicator, if you're a filmmaker, if you work in church media, whatever space you're in, this is going to there's going to be at least 1 or 2 stories every week that'll really help you a lot. So thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And I would encourage you, share this with somebody you know. If you know pastors, ministry leaders that need to know this information, particularly about navigating a crisis, I would encourage you, get this to them right away.